That's where the news conference will be held. And we now want to bring in somebody who really knows this area particularly well, Nile Gardiner. He's director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. He joins us from Washington. So particularly Margaret Thatcher's name resonates today. She was a conservative prime minister who didn't think very highly of the European Union, as I recall now.
Absolutely, and Margaret Thatcher, as early as 2002, urged the British people to think about leaving the European Union. So she was the first British politician to talk about Brexit, actually. And I'm sure that if Lady Thatcher were alive today, I think she would be absolutely appalled with this latest proposal put forward by Theresa May. I mean, this is a very bad deal. It's a deal that does not have the support, I think, of a majority of her own party. You've already seen a series of resignations from the cabinet. Margaret Thatcher would have stood up to the European Union, and she would have negotiated a strong, tough, robust deal in the British national interest. The deal that Theresa May has is not in Britain's interest. It shackles Britain to the European Union's customs union indefinitely. It also allows for the continuation of thousands of EU rules and regulations to apply to Great Britain, and also the European Court of Justice continues to have a say over British affairs. This is unacceptable, and I think it's a million miles away from where Margaret Thatcher, I think, would have negotiated an agreement for Britain.
Well, and the one thing we know for sure is that Prime Minister Thatcher was a very tough negotiator. She was very effective at that. Having said that, what negotiating power would she have had, after all, when Great Britain goes to the EU and says, we want out, and they say, okay, fine, leave? What's the leverage?
Well, I think the leverage you have is that the UK is the world's fifth largest economy. It's Europe's second largest economy. The EU has a clear interest, I think, in ensuring that trade business between Britain and the European Union continues without impediment. And I think that both sides have a clear interest in putting in place a successful free trade agreement that's going to work to the benefit of both London and Brussels. But this is a very one-sided deal that hugely is to the benefit of the European Union. This is not a deal, I think, that enables Britain, for example, to be able to negotiate its own free trade agreements. If Britain is tied to the customs union, it will not have sovereign control over its own trade. And that, of course, was a key issue for British voters in the 2016 referendum, Britain being outside of the customs union and the single market. And Theresa May simply has not delivered that. In fact, I think Britain is really shackled to the EU indefinitely as a sort of satellite, which is a disastrous scenario which firmly undercuts, I think, British sovereignty and British interests. And so Margaret Thatcher, I think, would have negotiated a deal that was good for Britain and that would help to facilitate a free trade between Great Britain and the European Union without Britain having to sacrifice its own sovereignty and self-determination.
Now, however we got to this juncture, we are where we are. And at this point, it appears, as the Prime Minister May actually said today in Parliament, there are three options. Essentially, the deal that she structured, that you think is a bad deal, or not leaving the European Union at all, or going out with any kind of agreement. Which would be best for the UK at this point?
Well, there's another option as well, which is a different deal for Britain. And I do believe that at this time Britain needs new leadership. It needs someone who is at the helm who actually believes fully in Brexit and is prepared to enter into tough negotiations with the European Union. If we don't get that, I think that Britain is better off in a no-deal scenario. And I think the deal that you have right now is completely unacceptable. But there is another option. It's another renegotiation with the European Union and getting a good deal for Britain. The Prime Minister seems to be completely refusing to even countenance that suggestion. I think there's a lot of hubris right now, actually, in Downing Street, with a lot of advisors who don't really understand the mood of the British people. They don't understand the mood within their own party as well. And when you have a leader who is out of touch with the British public, and an opinion poll today showed that less than 20% of the British public supports her new deal, this is a Prime Minister who I think is really out of her depth. And as Margaret Thatcher used to say, the Prime Minister has to listen to the beating heart of Middle England and the British people in order to succeed, and Theresa May simply isn't doing that.
Niall, I'm curious. The economists, pretty much universally, certainly the broad consensus, think it's a bad thing for the UK to leave the European Union. The markets clearly think it's a bad thing. They react badly whenever the prospect is brought up. What do you see that they're missing, both the markets and the economists?
Well, I think they're missing reality. Actually, the FTSE 100 is up over 20% since the Brexit referendum in 2016. That's a pretty good record. Foreign direct investment into the UK is at all-time record highs, and there's no evidence at all that US firms or even European firms are pulling out of Great Britain. And just as Britain thrived outside of the European single currency, I think Britain will thrive outside of the European Union as well. There's a lot of doom and gloom out there, but the reality is that the British economy is doing well. I think the foundations are there for tremendous success in the coming years, especially if Britain's able to negotiate a range of free trade agreements across the world, including with the United States. So I think that the long-term prospects of Britain are very, very optimistic. You'll always have economists and doom mongers out there who are going to predict the worst, but we've seen no evidence whatsoever that the sort of project fear rhetoric and warnings have borne any fruit at all. Quite the opposite, in fact.
Okay, Nile Gardiner, director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation, joining us from Washington. Thank you very much, Nile. That was truly helpful. Good to have you with us. So we continue now to wait for Prime Minister